The cuffs closed before I let myself look at his hands. That is the first thing I have to say, because it is the thing I have spent the years since trying to unsay. I was a constable then, 3 winters into the uniform, sure of my eye the way only a young man with a little authority can be sure. I saw a big man in a dark coat standing over 2 others in an alley off the Kingsmarket, and I read the scene the way you are trained to read it. The one still on his feet did the harm. The ones on the ground are the harmed. I did not wait. I did not ask. I put steel on the wrists of the one person in that street who had done everything right, and I told myself I was keeping the peace. His name was Sergeant Marius Vale. I did not know that yet. I knew only that he was bleeding, and that he did not seem to care that he was, and that a man who does not care about his own blood is a man you should be very slow to judge. I was not slow. I was quick, and I was wrong, and this is the account of how the whole weight of a kingdom came down that night to teach one arrogant boy in a police coat the difference. Let me set it where it happened. The Kingsmarket sits below the Palace Hill in the old part of the capital, a warren of narrow lanes and lamplit stalls that empties out after the traders pack their carts. By the hour I am telling you of, most of the light had gone home. There was a single gas lamp at the mouth of Tanner's Cut, an alley barely wide enough for 2 men to pass, and it threw more shadow than glow. My partner that night was Constable Pharaoh, older than me, heavier, slower to move and slower to speak, which I mistook then for a lack of nerve and understand now as the patience of a man who had been wrong before and had not enjoyed it. We were walking the market beat, bored, cold, waiting for the shift to burn down to its end. Then a woman came running up out of the dark with her hand pressed to her mouth, and the word she gave us was the word that turns a slow night sharp. "Fighting," she said, "in the cut. There's a man down, there's blood." I did not let her finish. That is my failing in one sentence. I did not let people finish. I was already moving, and Pharaoh was already lagging, calling my name in that low, unhurried way of his, and I rounded the corner into Tanner's Cut with my baton drawn and my certainty drawn with it. Here is what the lamp showed me. 2 young men were on the cobbles. One sat against the wall with his knees up and his hands over his head, rocking, making a high, thin sound. The other lay curled on his side near the drain, one arm crooked awkwardly beneath him, groaning. And standing over them, between them and the far end of the alley, was the big man in the dark coat. He was enormous. That was my first read of him, height and shoulders, and a stillness that in the shadow looked like menace. His coat hung open. Beneath it I could see a dark waistcoat, a pale shirt gone darker down one side, and even in that poor light I could see that the darkness on the shirt was wet and spreading. His right hand was open at his side. His left was pressed flat against his ribs. His face, when the lamp caught it, was not the face of a man in a fury. It was calm. It was almost tired, but I did not read calm. I read a man surveying what he had done. "Down," I shouted at him, "on the ground, hands where I can see them." He looked at me. He did not move to the ground. He said in a voice that was low and even and carried the whole length of the cut without being raised, "There is a third one. He ran east toward the river stairs. Send your partner. He is the one you want." I want you to understand how that landed on me, because it is the whole of my mistake in miniature. A guilty man, in my experience, does one of 2 things when the law arrives: he runs, or he explains himself in a flood. He does not stand perfectly still and give you tactical instructions in a calm command voice, pointing you toward a suspect who has already fled. That is what an innocent man does. That is, in fact, what a soldier does. And I heard it, and my pride flipped it upside down. I thought, he is cool because he is dangerous. I thought, he is telling me where to look, so I will look away from him. I said, "Get down," I told him. The one against the wall, the rocker, lowered his hands enough to look at me with wet eyes, and he pointed a shaking finger at the big man, and he gave me the lie that I swallowed whole. "He attacked us," he said. "We were just walking through, and he had a knife. He went mad. He cut my brother. Please, please get him away from us." And the big man in the coat said nothing to that. Nothing at all. He looked at the boy against the wall with an expression I could not name then and can name now. It was the look of a man watching another man dig a hole he will not be able to climb out of. And then he looked back at me, and he took his left hand away from his ribs, and he held both hands out in front of him, wrists together, offered. "Constable," he said, "you are going to arrest someone tonight. Do it, and then listen in that order. But send your partner east now, or you lose the one who did this." I should have heard it. Pharaoh heard it. Pharaoh, coming up behind me at last, breathing hard, looked past me at the man and then down at the two on the ground, and I heard the old constable go very quiet in the particular way a careful man goes quiet when the picture in front of him does not add up. But I was already reaching for my cuffs. I was already deciding. And a young man's decision, once made, is a hard thing to unmake in front of an audience. "Pharaoh," I said, "river stairs, go." At least I did that. At least the man's own words sent my partner east after the one who mattered. Pharaoh looked at me and looked at the big man, and something passed over his face. A warning he did not have time to say, and then he turned and went at his heavy jog toward the river. That left me and the man in the coat, and the two liars on the ground. "Hands," I said again, and this time he gave them to me, wrists crossed, held steady even as I saw a fresh line of red run down from under his sleeve and drip off the point of his thumb onto the cobbles. I snapped the cuffs on. I remember the sound. I have heard that sound 10,000 times in my service, and I remember that one, the small final click of it, because of everything that came after. He did not flinch when the steel bit. He did not curse me. He simply lowered his cuffed hands to his front and stood there, a head and a half taller than me, bleeding quietly onto the stones, and he said, "Now, my name is Vale, Sergeant of the King's Household Guard. The man your partner is chasing put a blade into that shopkeeper 20 paces behind you, and then into me when I stopped him. Check the man against the wall's right sleeve. You'll find the cut he claims I gave his brother came from his brother's own hand when I took the knife off him. And check behind the crates. There is an old man there who will tell you all of this, if he can still speak." I did not check behind the crates. I am not proud of the next part. I want to be honest with you about it, because the point of telling this at all is that a man in a uniform can be certain and armed and completely wrong, and the only thing that saves the world from him is when someone with more sense arrives. So, I did not check behind the crates. I heard King's Household Guard, and I heard it as the desperate invention of a cornered man. Everybody claims to be something when the cuffs go on. I have had men swear to me they were magistrates, physicians, cousins of the chamberlain. The bigger the claim, the guiltier they usually are. So when this bleeding giant told me, calm as still water, that he was a king's guardsman, I actually laughed. Short and ugly. I laughed at him. "Sure you are," I said, "and I'm the crown prince." "Walk." He looked at me for a long moment. I have tried many times since to describe the quality of that look. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was a kind of grave, patient disappointment, the look a man gives a boy who has just done a foolish thing that the boy does not yet know is foolish. A look that says, "You will understand this later, and I am sorry for you that you will." Then he inclined his head, once, a small controlled nod, the way a soldier acknowledges an order he thinks is wrong but will obey, and he walked. Behind the crates, unseen by me because I would not look, an old man named Osric Brand lay against the wall with a wound in his side, and the guardsman's own folded neckcloth pressed into it by the guardsman's own hand before I ever arrived. He was 71 years old. He had sold candles and oil at the third stall from the fountain for 40 years. And 49 years before this night he had been a private soldier in the king's army, and he knew exactly what the ribbon on the big man's chest meant if only someone would let him get the words out. Nobody would. Not yet. The woman who had run to fetch us was standing at the mouth of the cut with her hand still at her mouth, and as I marched my prisoner past her she said, "Officer, officer, it wasn't him. He helped, I saw." "Statement at the station," I said without stopping, and I heard her make a small helpless sound behind me, and I kept walking my bleeding guardsman toward the wagon, sure as sunrise that I had the right man. This is where I have to tell you what I did not know, so that you can feel the size of the ground opening under me later, the way I felt it. I did not know that the calm giant in cuffs at my side had, 11 years before, thrown his own body across a 9-year-old boy in a public square, when a man with a grievance and a hidden blade lunged out of a cheering crowd. I did not know that the boy had been the king's only son and heir, and that the man had taken the wound meant for the child across his own back and shoulder and had still, bleeding, put the attacker on the ground and kept him there until help came. I did not know that for that the king of Eldermore had, with his own hands in front of the whole court, pinned the Cross of Valor to the man's chest, the highest thing the realm can give a living soul, and had said words over him that were not the usual words, private words, a debt named aloud that a king is not supposed to owe anyone. I did not know that this man could have had any command in the army for the asking, that colonels had offered him their own posts, that the crown prince, grown now to a young man, still called him by his first name and still, once a year on a certain date, sought him out to shake his hand. I did not know that Sergeant Marius Vale had turned all of it down, the promotions, the estates, the soft postings, and had asked for one thing only, to be allowed to keep standing a guardsman's post at the palace he had bled for in the ranks, anonymous under the tall black bearskin, one still figure among many. Because, he would say much later in the only explanation he ever gave, a man should guard the thing he loves with his own hands and not from behind a desk. I did not know any of that. I knew only that my prisoner was tall and quiet and bleeding, and that he had had the nerve to tell me he was a king's guardsman, and I had laughed in his face and called myself the crown prince to mock him. The wagon took us up the hill to the cobbleside station in the dark, the 2 young men riding in the back with us, for I had cuffed them too, at last, on Pharaoh's shouted insistence when he came panting back empty-handed from the river. The third had gone over the stairs and into the dark, and was, for that night, lost. So there we sat, the 4 of us and the smell of blood, jolting up the cobbles. 2 frightened liars, 1 confused old man we had finally lifted onto a stretcher, and the calm enormous guardsman with the Cross of Valor under his ruined shirt and steel on his wrists, saying nothing, watching me with that same grave patience, waiting, I understand now, for the world to catch up with the truth, as he was so certain it eventually would. It took its time, but it came like weather. The cobbleside station at that hour was a low, gaslit room that smelled of wet wool and cold tea, presided over by a desk sergeant named Harlow, who had the disposition of a man who would very much like everyone to stop bringing him problems and let him finish the night in peace. When the wagon disgorged us onto the step, 2 limping prisoners, 1 bleeding one stretcher, Harlow looked up from his ledger with the flat resentment of a tired official and did not get up. "What have you got?" he said, not a question, an accusation aimed at the amount of paperwork walking through his door. "A fray in the Kingsmarket," I said, marching Vale to the front of the desk. "1 down with a stab wound on the stretcher. This one," I put my hand on the guardsman's cuffed arm, "did it. 2 witnesses on scene. A 3rd suspect fled." I felt Vale go very slightly still under my hand at the word "did it." Not a flinch. A kind of settling, the way a man plants his weight when he decides he is going to stand somewhere for a long time. He said nothing. He had, in fact, said nothing since I laughed at him in the alley. He had given me his name and his rank and his account once completely in that calm command voice, and when I had thrown it back in his face he had simply stopped offering it. He would not, I learned over that long night, beg. He would not repeat himself. He would state a thing that was true once to a person who had the authority and the sense to act on it, and if they would not, he would fold his hands and wait for someone who would. I mistook that too. I mistook it for the sullenness of the guilty. It was the discipline of a man who had decided the truth did not need his panic to hold it up. Harlow looked the prisoner up and down, took in the height, the ruined shirt, the blood still ticking off the man's fingers onto the floorboards. "He's bleeding on my floor," Harlow observed, as though this were another inconvenience Vale had arranged specifically to spite him. "Knife wound to the side," I said. "His own doing, I expect." "We'll have the surgeon look." "I'll have the surgeon look," said a voice from the stretcher, thin and cracked and furious. "At the man who put himself between me and a blade, you great fool of a boy, and not before he's seen to, do you hear me?" That was Osric Brand, the old candle seller, coming up out of his shock at last, propped on one elbow on the stretcher with a bandage dark at his side, and his eyes bright and terrible in his gray face. The two constables who had carried him tried to press him back down. He would not be pressed. "I heard you," he said to me, and his voice shook, but it did not stop. "I heard you laugh at him, in the cut. I lay there with his neckcloth in my side that he tied there with his own hands, and I heard you call yourself the Crown Prince to mock him, and I thought, God help this kingdom, they've made a policeman out of a stone." He fell back, coughing, and his hand groped out and found nothing to hold. "Ask me what happened. Somebody in this room ask me what happened before you throw that man in a cell." The room had gone quiet around the old man's fury. Harlow, to his credit, set down his pen. "All right, grandfather," he said. "What happened?" And Osric Brand told it, in pieces, between breaths, and every piece of it was a stone laid on the scale against me. He had been closing his stall, the third from the fountain, oil and candles, 40 years. 3 young men he did not know had come out of Tanner's Cut and asked him for his takings. When he had refused, one of them had shown him a knife, and when he had still refused because, he said, 40 years is 40 years and he was not going to hand it to 3 louts on his own doorstep, the one with the knife had used it. "Put it in me like I was nothing," the old man said. "Like I was a sack." He had gone down against the crates. He had thought that was the end of him. And then, he said, a man had come out of the dark at a dead run. A big man, in a dark coat over his palace kit, off duty, walking home the back way up the hill, and had gone through the 3 of them like the wrath of the king himself. "He didn't draw a weapon," Osric said. "He didn't have one off duty. He put the 2 big ones down with his hands and he took the knife off the 3rd. That's when the coward cut him, across the ribs, taking the blade off him, and the 3rd one broke and ran for the river. And then, before he did one more thing, before he even looked to his own side that was open and pouring, he came to me. He came to me first. He knelt down in the filth and he took the cloth from his own neck and he pushed it into the hole in me and he held it there and he said, 'Hold on, soldier. You held worse than this once. Hold on.' The old man's voice broke entirely on that. He called me soldier. He saw the old regiment ring on my hand and he called me soldier, and he kept me alive with his own 2 hands. And then this child in a coat, put those same hands in irons." I stood there in the gaslight with my ears going hot and my certainty, for the first time, beginning to hum like a struck glass, not broken yet, but ringing with the promise of it. Because here is the thing that a proud young man does when the ground first shifts. He does not step back. He digs in. I had committed to a version of the night in front of Harlow, in front of Pharaoh, in front of the whole low room, and the more the old man talked the more it cost me to have been wrong, and so, God forgive me, I looked for reasons to still be right. "Old men in shock misremember," I said. "It was dark. He says a big man saved him, fine, and here's a big man standing over the scene with blood on him. Same man, who says the saving isn't the story he tells to cover the doing." I turned to the 2 young prisoners. The rocker and his groaning brother sat now on the bench along the wall. What do you say happened?" And the rocker, his name, we would learn, was Denny Cobb, and he was a practiced small liar with an unpracticed guilty face, wiped his nose and said, "It's like I told you. We were just walking through. He came at us. He's a madman, look at the size of him. We never touched the old man, we never even saw the old man." "You never saw him," said Osric Brand from the stretcher, deadly quiet now, "and yet you know he's old." The room heard that. Even Denny Cobb heard that, and his mouth opened and shut. And Harlow, who had not built 30 years behind that desk without learning the exact sound a lie makes when it steps on its own foot, looked at the young man on the bench for a long, slow moment, and then looked at me, and the look was not kind. "Constable Kell," he said, "uncuff the big fella and put him in a chair. Get the surgeon to his side. And you and I are going to have a word about the order you did things in tonight." I did not want to uncuff him. I want to be honest. Even then, with the old man's testimony ringing and the young liar's mouth working like a landed fish, my pride did not want to give the giant his hands back, because giving him his hands back meant admitting I should never have taken them. But Harlow was the desk, and the desk is the desk. I took out my key. I went behind the big man. My hands were not entirely steady. And it was there, close behind him, reaching for the cuffs, that I saw the two things I had been too certain to see in the alley. The first was on the back of his shoulder, where the ruined shirt had torn and pulled aside, an old scar, long healed, a broad pale seam of it running from the base of his neck down across the shoulder blade, the kind of scar that does not come from a bar fight or an accident, the kind that a surgeon closes in a great hurry while a man's life runs out under his hands. A wound that had nearly killed him, years ago, and had been meant for someone else. I did not know that yet. But I knew a grave wound when I saw one, and something in me went cold looking at it. The second was the ribbon. When I lifted his cuffed hands to unlock them, his coat fell further open, and beneath the blood-dark shirt, pinned to the waistcoat he wore under it, was a short bar of ribbon, the kind of thing a man wears in place of a full medal when he is not in his dress uniform, a discreet strip of colored silk that means nothing to those who do not know it and everything to those who do. I did not know it, but Osric Brand did. Osric Brand, 49 years a candle seller and 49 years and 1 day a soldier, saw that ribbon from the stretcher across the room, and the old man made a sound I have never forgotten, a small broken intake of breath, half a sob, and he said, into the quiet, "Do you even know," he said to me, to Harlow, to the whole ignorant room, "do you even know what that is on his chest? Do you know what you've put in irons tonight?" And the giant, for the first time since I had laughed at him in the alley, spoke. "Leave it, soldier," Sergeant Vale said quietly to the old man. "Not to me, to Osric, gentle almost. I'm not here as that, I'm here as a man who was walking home. Let it be seen to properly." He turned his head and his eyes found mine, close as I was behind him with the key in the lock, and he said the thing I have carried ever since. "A man's name should be enough," he said. "I gave you mine. You'll find it's a true one whatever's pinned to it. You didn't need the rest to do right by me. You only needed to wait." Then the cuffs came off, and he brought his freed hands around to the front and pressed one of them without any fuss, back against his ruined side. And he sat at last, in the chair Harlow had ordered and bled, patient as stone, while the room began, far too slowly, to understand what it had done. The station surgeon was a tired, competent woman named Dr. Pell, who arrived with her bag and her spectacles, and a permanent expression of having seen worse. She knelt at the guardsman's side, cut his shirt further open with a small pair of shears, looked at the wound, and then looked up at me over the tops of her spectacles with an expression that made me want to leave the room. "Who let this go untended for an hour?" she said. Nobody answered. She had not really asked. She worked in silence for a while, packing and binding the long shallow cut along his ribs. It was, she said, long but not deep, a slash and not a stab, the kind of wound you take when you are pushing a knife away from yourself rather than letting it come, which was one more small quiet fact laid on the scale, and as she worked her eye fell, as Osric's had, on the ribbon pinned to the waistcoat. She stopped. Her hands went still. She looked at it, and then she looked at the man's face, really looked, the way you look at a face you are trying to place, and I watched the color change in her cheeks. "Sergeant," she said low, "forgive me, are you?" "I'm a man with a cut in his side, Doctor," Vale said kindly, "and you're the best thing that's happened to me tonight. Finish your work. The rest can wait." She finished her work, but she did it now with a care that had turned into something else, something close to reverence, her competent hands very gentle, and when she was done she stood and drew Harlow aside to the far end of the desk and spoke to him in a murmur I could not hear, and I watched the desk sergeant's tired face go from resentment to attention to something I had never seen on Harlow's face in 3 years of bringing him problems. I watched him go pale. "Kell," Harlow said when Dr. Pell had gone back to check on old Osric. His voice had changed. "The big man's name, he gave it to you. Give it to me." "Vale," I said. "Sergeant Vale, household guard," he claimed. "He didn't claim anything," Harlow said. "He told you a fact and you laughed at it." "Marius Vale." I did not know the first name, I said so, and Sergeant Vale from his chair without any particular emphasis supplied it. "Marius," he said. "Yes." Harlow sat down slowly at his desk, and he pulled the great bound station register toward him, and then he pushed it away again, because the thing he wanted was not in a station register. It was in a different book entirely, a book kept up the hill, a book that most desk sergeants go their whole careers without ever needing to open. He looked at me and Pharaoh, and he said, in the flat voice of a man choosing his next words with unusual care. "There is a list," Harlow said, "that comes down from the palace to every station in the capital. It is not a long list. It is names, a handful of names of persons who, by the king's own standing order, are to be extended every courtesy, and if they are ever taken into custody for any reason whatsoever, are to be reported up the chain immediately, that hour, no delay, no discretion. Protected persons. Household mostly. A few others." He wet his lips. "I have never had cause to look at that list in 11 years behind this desk. I am going to look at it now. And I am very much hoping, Constable Kell, for your sake, that the name Marius Vale is not on it." He unlocked the lower drawer of his desk. He took out a slim folder, sealed with a palace stamp that I had genuinely never known was there. He broke the seal. He ran his finger down a short page. His finger stopped. I have thought many times about the quality of the silence in that room while Sergeant Harlow's finger sat on that line of the page. It was not the silence of a room where nothing is happening. It was the silence of a room where something enormous is happening very quietly, the way the sea draws back off the sand before a great wave, all the water going the wrong way, smooth and terrible, and every creature on the beach knowing, without being told, that it should already be running. "It's here," Harlow said. He did not look up. "His name is here, near the top." He read, and his voice, which I had only ever heard bored or annoyed, came out changed, careful, almost formal. "Sergeant Marius Vale, King's Household Guard, Cross of Valour. To be reported to the palace personally without delay in any matter touching his safety, his liberty, or his honor." He set the folder down. He looked at last up at the enormous quiet man bleeding in the chair against his wall, and then at me, and there was no resentment left in his face at all, only a kind of horror. "His liberty," Harlow said softly. "We put him in irons and left him to bleed. His liberty. Kell, do you understand what has happened here tonight?" I did not yet, entirely. I understood that the man I had cuffed was somebody. I did not yet understand how much of a somebody, or what it would mean when the palace came down the hill, because I had never in my life seen the palace come down the hill for anyone. But I understood enough to feel the floor of my certainty give way at last, all at once, the struck glass finally shattering, and I understood that I had done something that could not be undone by being sorry. And then, before Harlow could reach for the telephone to make the call the order demanded, the door of the station banged open, and the night got worse, and then, much later, and by a longer road than any of us expected, it got better than any of us deserved. The man who came through the door was Superintendent Vare, no relation, an unlucky closeness of name that I have always thought God arranged as a small joke at my expense. The divisional commander, hauled from his bed by the duty telephone with the words, "Stabbing in the Kingsmarket," and arriving in the particular temper of a senior officer who has staked his advancement on the district's figures, and does not want a market murder spoiling them a month before the assizes. He was a lean, hard, ambitious man, Superintendent Vare, and he took in the room the blood, the stretcher, the prisoners, the giant in the chair, with the eye of a man calculating not what had happened but what could be made to have happened in a way that cost him least. "Well," he said, "have we got him? The one who did the old man?" "Sir," Harlow began, "there's a complication." "I don't want a complication, Harlow, I want a charge sheet." Vare's eye fell on Sergeant Vale, the biggest and bloodiest man in the room, sitting cuffed, no, uncuffed, but Vare did not notice that or did not care against the wall. "That him. Big fellow, blood on him. Good. Constable Kell, is it you took him at the scene?" "I did, sir, but—" "Standing over the victim?" "Over the two others, sir, but—" "Two witnesses put him at it." There are two young men who say." "Then we've got him," said Superintendent Vare, with the satisfaction of a man closing a ledger, "and I can go back to bed. Charge him, affray and wounding. We'll add the intent in the morning when the old man," he glanced at the stretcher, "one way or the other. Well done, Kell. Quick collar. That's the kind of policing this division." "His name," said Harlow, "is on the palace list, sir." I have never seen a man stop talking as fast as Superintendent Vare stopped talking then. Harlow held up the broken-sealed folder. He did not need to say more. Every senior officer in the capital knew what that folder was, even if most of them, like Harlow, had gone their whole careers without opening it. Vare crossed the room in 3 strides and took it and read the line himself twice, and I watched the ambition drain out of his hard face and something colder and more calculating flow in to replace it. And here I have to be exact about this, because it is the ugliest turn of the whole night and the one that came closest to burying the truth for good. Here Superintendent Vare did not do the right thing. A good man, reading that line, feels shame and moves at once to undo the wrong. Vare did not feel shame. Vare felt danger to himself, to his figures, to his advancement, and his whole mind bent instantly not toward justice but toward damage. "Right," he said quietly, closing the folder. "Right. Nobody has charged anybody. Is that clear? Nobody in this room has charged this man with anything. Kell, there is no arrest report. There is no cuffing. There was an incident in the market, and a King's Guardsman was injured helping the constabulary detain some suspects, and the constabulary rendered him every assistance and courtesy. And that is the report. That is the only report. And if I hear a single other version of tonight leave this station, I will have the man who said it walking a more beat till he's 60. Am I understood?" "That's a lie," I heard myself say. It surprised me as much as anyone. I had spent the whole night wrong and defending my wrongness, and here at last was a lie offered to me that would save my skin. No arrest report. No record that Constable Kell had cuffed a decorated guardsman and laughed in his face and left him to bleed. All I had to do was take it. All I had to do was let the story be smoothed over, and I would be, on paper, the constable who assisted an injured hero instead of the fool who arrested him. And I stood in that gaslit room with the old candle seller watching me from the stretcher and the giant watching me from the chair, and I found that I could not take it. Not because I was brave. I want to be truthful. I do not think it was courage. I think it was that I had been shown, in the space of an hour, exactly what a lie in a uniform costs the innocent, and I had a bellyful of it, and it would not go down. "It's a lie, sir," I said again. "I cuffed him. I left him bleeding. I laughed in his face when he told me the truth. There's an arrest, and it's mine, and I'll not have it written up as a courtesy. Whatever's coming to me for it, write it true." Superintendent Vare looked at me the way you look at a subordinate who has just become a problem, and he opened his mouth to make me a smaller problem. And that is the exact moment the second wave came through the door. They did not bang it open the way Vare had. They opened it the way soldiers open a door they mean to come through in numbers, quietly, fully, and all at once. 4 men of the King's household guard, in the dark undress uniform they wear off the ceremonial line, filled the doorway and then the front of the room, and they were not loud, and they were not gentle, and the temperature of the whole station dropped 10 degrees when they entered. The one in front was older than the rest, iron gray at the temples, with the bearing of a man who had spent 30 years making other men stand up straight. He would prove to be Color Sergeant Aldous Rook, Sergeant Vale's own senior, and he had come because Vale had not come. That was the whole of it in the beginning. A guardsman walking home up the back lanes from the palace had not reached his quarters by the hour he always reached them, a man whose habits were as fixed as the changing of the watch, and his section had not shrugged and gone to bed. They had gone looking. They had followed the one road he walked, down through the Kingsmarket, and they had found a closed candle stall with blood on the crates, and a market woman weeping at the mouth of Tanner's Cut who told them, between sobs, that the police had taken a great kind man away in irons for a thing he did not do. So they had come to the Cobbleside station. And Color Sergeant Rook stood in the middle of that gaslit room, and his eyes went straight past Superintendent Vale, as though the superintendent were a coat rack, and found Sergeant Vale in the chair against the wall, the cut side, the ruined shirt, the gray exhaustion of a big man who has lost more blood than he lets on, and something happened in the old soldier's face that I can only describe as an old grief and an old fury waking up together. "Marius," Rook said. "Aldous," Vale answered. "It's not as bad as it looks. Long, not deep. The doctor's good." "They cuffed you." Rook did not phrase it as a question. He had seen the marks the steel leaves. He was looking at Vale's wrists. "A young constable made a fast decision in a dark alley," Vale said, "and I will remember this until I die." His eyes moved as he said it to me, and there was no accusation in them. He owned it since. That counts for more than the alley does. Color Sergeant Rook turned then and looked at me for the first time, and I would rather have been looked at by almost anything else. But he did not strike me, or curse me, or even raise his voice. He simply looked, long and cold, taking my measure and finding it small, and then he turned to Superintendent Vale, who had drawn himself up to his full rank and was preparing, I could see, to take control of the room. "You are the officer in charge here," Vale began. "I am superintendent." "I know who you are," said Rook. "I want to know what you've done. This man is Sergeant Marius Vale of the King's Household Guard. He holds the Cross of Valour. 11 years ago he took a blade meant for the king's own son across his back and shoulder and lived, barely, and put the man who threw it on the ground and held him there. There is not a soldier in this kingdom who does not know his name, and there is not a man at the palace, from the meanest bootblack to the king himself, who does not owe him a debt he can never pay. And you put him in irons in the gutter and left him to bleed on this floor." Rook's voice never rose. It got quieter and harder, like a blade being drawn slowly across a stone. "So I will ask you once, Superintendent, plainly, what have you done? And what do you intend to do about it?" Superintendent Vale, to my disgust, tried the smooth version first, the version where nobody had cuffed anyone, where the guardsman had been injured assisting the police and rendered every courtesy, the tidy lie he had ordered 5 minutes before. He got perhaps 10 words into it. There was no arrest, Color Sergeant. An incident in the market, the sergeant was hurt helping our men detain suspects, and we. "That's a lie," I said for the 3rd time that night, and this time my voice did not shake at all. "Sir." I stepped forward into the middle of the room, into the light in front of the guardsmen and the superintendent and my own sergeant and the old man on the stretcher, and I made myself say it whole. "Color Sergeant. I'm the constable who did it. I found Sergeant Vale standing over 2 men in the cut, and I read it wrong, and I cuffed him without asking a single question. He told me who he was and what had happened, calm and clear, and I laughed at him and called him a liar. He offered me his hands and I put steel on them. He told me an old man was dying behind the crates and I wouldn't even go and look. Everything he did tonight was right and everything I did was wrong, and my superintendent has just ordered me to have it written up as a courtesy, and I won't. That's what's been done. There was an arrest. It was mine. I'll answer for it." The room was very quiet. Color Sergeant Rook looked at me for a long moment, and something in the cold of his face shifted, not to warmth, but to a kind of grim reassessment. "How old are you, Constable?" "3 years in, Color Sergeant." "And you've just called your own commander a liar to his face in front of witnesses to keep an honest account of your own worst hour." He nodded slowly once. "That's the first thing you've done tonight I'd not be ashamed to have my name near. Remember how it feels. You'll need it again." Superintendent Vare made a strangled sound. "Constable Kell, you are relieved." "He is not," said a new voice from the doorway, a woman's voice, breathless, and I turned. And it was the market woman, the one who had run to fetch us. The one I had brushed past with statement at the station, and she was not alone. Beside her stood a young woman of perhaps 20 with a shopgirl's apron still on under her shawl, and a small telephone held out in front of her in both hands like an offering. And behind them, a knot of market people who had followed the guardsmen down through the lanes and would not be turned back. "I filmed it," the young woman said, her voice shaking, "from my window over the cut. I heard the old man shout and I looked out and I filmed the whole of it. The 3 of them on Mr. Brand and the big man coming. And you can see it. You can see the one with the knife cut him and run. You can see him kneel down to Mr. Brand. It's all here. It's all on here. Please, please make them watch it." And Superintendent Vare, who a moment before had been ordering the whole night erased, saw the little telephone in the girl's hands and understood, the way a drowning man understands the shore is too far, that the night could not be erased, because the night had been recorded, and there were 40 market people in the doorway who had already heard the truth of it. And there were 4 King's Guardsmen in the room and a color sergeant with the Cross of Valor's own brother-in-arms bleeding in a chair, and there was, God help him, a constable of his own division standing in the middle of the floor insisting on his own guilt at the top of his voice, and the lie was dead. It had died the moment the girl held up her hands. Vare's mouth closed. His shoulders came down. The ambition went out of him like air out of a punctured skin, and what was left was just a frightened middle-aged man in a coat thrown over his nightshirt, who had gambled on the wrong thing and lost. But it was not the girl's telephone in the end that broke the night fully open. It was not even the guardsman, or the old man, or my own confession. Those things settled the small justice, the who did what of an alley in the King's Market. What broke the night open, what turned it from a story about a wronged man into the thing I have spent my life telling, was the last arrival. Because Color Sergeant Rook, before he had come down the hill, had done what the King's own standing order required, and what Superintendent Vare had tried so hard to prevent. He had sent word up to the palace that Sergeant Marius Vale had been taken by the police and hurt. And the palace had not sent a clerk. We heard them before we saw them, not a clamor, but the opposite, a spreading hush that ran up the street outside the station and in through the door, the sound a crowd makes when it stops talking all at once because something is coming that it did not expect to see. Then the ring of hooves on cobbles, and the particular metal music of a mounted escort halting, and horses breathing in the cold, and boots, a great many boots, coming to a halt, and to attention in the street with a single crash that rattled the station windows in their frames. Superintendent Vare went to the window. I watched the back of his neck. I watched it go white. "That's," he said, and could not finish it. He turned around and his face had come apart entirely. "That's the royal standard on the carriage. That's the Harlow. Harlow, that's the Crown Prince's own colors. The Crown Prince is at the door of your station." And Sergeant Marius Vale, the giant, the liar I had cuffed, the nobody I had laughed at, the man bleeding patiently in a chair against the wall of a suburban police station at 2 in the morning, closed his eyes for a moment. And when he opened them there was something in them that was almost pain, and he said, very quietly, to no one, to himself, to the old friend who was not in the room, "He shouldn't have come. I told them never to trouble him with me." He drew a breath and squared his ruined shoulders and made to stand out of respect and could not quite manage it on the first try. But he always did, Vale said. From a boy, he always did come. The door opened. I had never seen Crown Prince Rowan except at a distance, on a balcony, on a coin. Every subject of Eldermore carried a picture of him in their head, and the picture was of a young man raised to be looked at poised, remote, finished, the way the heir to a throne is finished, all the human edges filed smooth by a lifetime of being watched. That is not the man who came through the door of the Cobbleside station that night. The man who came through the door was young, yes, and he wore a plain dark coat thrown on over evening clothes, and he had come at speed, and it showed, his hair disordered, his color high, a man dragged out of a palace at 2 in the morning by the worst news he could have been given. He came in fast and stopped just inside the threshold, and his eyes went round the room once, past the superintendent, past me, past the stretcher and the guardsmen and the crowd at the door, searching, and found the big man half risen from the chair against the wall, and everything else in the Crown Prince's face fell away. "Marius," he said. And Sergeant Vale, on his feet now by main will, blood at his side and gray in the face, drew himself up and gave his prince a bow of the head that was correct in every degree. And Rowan crossed the room and took him by the shoulders before he had finished it, both hands gripping him, the way you grip a man to make sure he is really standing there, really alive. "You're hurt," the Crown Prince said. "How badly?" "Tell me true, none of your it's nothing. How badly?" "Long, not deep, sir. The doctor's seen to it. I'll drill on it in a week." "You will not. You'll rest as she tells you." Rowan's hands were still on the big man's shoulders. He seemed, for a moment, to have forgotten there was anyone else in the room. And then he did remember, and he turned, still keeping one hand on Vale's arm as if to reassure himself, and he looked at us. The assembled constabulary of the Cobbleside division, and its superintendent and its shame, and the finished remoteness came back down over his young face like a visor closing, and it was cold, and it was terrible, and it was very, very quiet. "Which of you," said the Crown Prince of Eldermore, "put irons on this man?" Nobody spoke. Superintendent Vere took half a step forward, his mouth already shaping some smooth divisional sentence, and I could not let him have it. I had earned this the hard way, and I would not let a coward take it off me. "I did, sir," I said. "Constable Kell, it was me. Nobody ordered it and nobody helped it. I found him in the alley and I read it wrong and I cuffed him without asking, and when he told me who he was I laughed at him. It's mine, all of it's mine." Rowan looked at me. I will not pretend I met that look easily. It went through me like cold water. Here was a young man my own age, more or less, and he was looking at me with the settled, bottomless anger of someone who has just been told that a person he loves was left bleeding in a gutter by a fool with a pair of handcuffs, and every instinct in me wanted to look at the floor. I made myself hold his eyes. I owed him that much, and Vale had shown me how it was done. "You laughed at him," Rowan repeated, softly, as if testing whether he had heard it right. "Yes, sir." "Do you know who he is?" "I'm learning it, sir. I didn't. When I did it, I didn't." "Then let me teach you," said the Crown Prince, "since it seems no one in this station troubled to learn it before they put a man of the king's own household in chains." And he turned so that he was speaking not only to me but to the whole room, and he told it, and I have heard it told many times since, in the ballad they made of it, in the school books, but I heard it first there, in the gaslight, from the mouth of the man it had happened to, and no ballad has ever come near it. "When I was 9 years old," Rowan said, "my father took me to the Founding Day Fair in the Great Square because I had begged him, because there were to be tumblers and a bear that danced and a man who ate fire, and I was a boy and I wanted to see them. There were thousands of people. And in the crowd there was a man, I will not dignify him by name. He had a grievance against my father that had rotted into something that wanted blood, and he had a long knife under his coat, and he got close, closer than anyone should ever have got, because a crowd of thousands cheering a boy makes a fine screen for a man with murder in him. And he lunged. For me. for a 9-year-old boy who wanted to see a bear dance. Rowan's voice did not shake, but it had gone very low, and the whole room leaned into it without meaning to. I did not even see him. Children don't. I was looking at the fire eater. I never saw the knife or the man or anything at all, because before it reached me, a young guardsman who was 3 men down the line, off his own post, who should by every rule have stood where he was told to stand, left his post and threw himself the whole width of that gap and put his own body between the blade and me. He looked at Vale. Vale was looking at the floor now, his jaw set, plainly wishing himself anywhere else in the world. It went into his back, Rowan said, across the shoulder, deep. The surgeons told my father afterward that another inch, another moment, and Eldermore would have buried a guardsman that week for certain, and very possibly a boy prince beside him. And do you know what he did, with a knife in his back and his blood running out of him? He did not fall. He turned and he took the man down and he pinned him to the cobbles of the square and held him there, bleeding, going gray, while the guard closed in because he was afraid that if he let go to see to himself, the man might get up and try again for me. He held on until they took the man from under his hands, and then, and only then, he let himself fall. Rowan's throat worked. I was 9. I sat on the cobbles of the great square with my father's arms around me, and I watched them carry away the man who had saved my life on a litter with a sheet going dark, and I was sure, the way a child is sure, that I had killed him by wanting to see a bear. He was 3 days coming back to us. 3 days. My father did not sleep for any of them. The station was silent. Even the horses outside seemed to have gone still. When he could stand again, Rowan went on, my father put the Cross of Valour on his chest with his own hands in front of the whole court, and said words over him that kings are not supposed to say, that the house of Eldermore owed this man a debt it could not discharge, and that its debt would stand as long as its line did. And then my father offered him anything, a colonelcy, land, a title and an estate to go with the medal. A soft place at court for the rest of his days, earned 100 times over. Rowan almost smiled, and the almost smile was the saddest thing in it. And Marius Vale, this man you cuffed in a gutter and laughed at, turned it all down, every scrap of it. He asked my father for one thing and one thing only. He asked to be allowed to go back and stand a guardsman's post, in the ranks, anonymous, just a tall man under a bearskin at a gate. My father asked him why, and do you know what he said? I said, Sergeant Vale put in quietly, still looking at the floor, plainly unable to bear having it said for him, that a man should guard the thing he loves with his own 2 hands, sir, and not from behind a desk. That's all. It's not a grand thing. Please stop making it a grand thing. It is the grandest thing I know, said the Crown Prince, and I have stopped for no one in 11 years, and I will not stop now. He turned back to the room. For 11 years this man has stood a post at the palace he bled for in the ranks, taking no rank he did not have to, wanting no one to know his name. He has stood in the rain and the cold and the heat while tourists mocked him and children pulled faces at him and drunks shouted in his face, and he has never once said, "Do you know who I am?" Not once. It would have ended any of it in a heartbeat, and he never said it. Tonight he was walking home from that post, off duty, up the back lanes because he did not want a carriage, and he heard an old man cry out under 3 knives, and he did again exactly what he did when he was a young man in that square. He left his own safety on the ground and put his body in the way of the blade. And for that, you put him in chains and left him to bleed on your floor and laughed in his face when he told you the truth. Rowan's voice finally cracked, just once on the last of it. You want to know who he is, constable. He is the reason I am alive to stand in this wretched room and tell you so. That is who you cuffed tonight. I did not have anything to say to that. There is nothing to say to that. I stood in the middle of the floor with the whole size of what I had done finally on top of me, and I did the only honest thing left, which was to take it, in silence, the way Vale had taken the cuffs, without excuse, without a flood of words, just standing there and letting the truth be true. But it was Sergeant Vale in the end, who broke that silence. And what he did with it is the reason I am the man I am today instead of the man I was at 2 o'clock that morning. Sir, he said, may I say a thing before this goes where it's going? Rowan turned to him at once, the anger going out of his voice the moment he addressed his friend. You may say anything you like, always. Then I'd ask you to be careful with that one. Vale nodded at me. The young constable. He did a wrong thing in the alley, and it was a bad wrong, and it cost me an hour and some blood, and it nearly cost that old soldier on the stretcher his life while I sat in a chair instead of tending him. I'll not pretend it was small, but he drew a slow breath. It plainly cost him. But when the smooth road opened for him, when his own superintendent stood in this room and offered to erase the whole night and make him the hero of it instead of the fool, he wouldn't take it. He stood in the middle of this floor and called his own commander a liar and put his own guilt into words at the top of his voice, 3 times in front of witnesses, when a single silence would have saved his career. That's a rarer thing than you'd think, sir. I've watched men my whole life do the wrong thing in an instant and then spend years defending it because they hadn't the stomach to be seen wrong. This one couldn't stomach the lie more than he couldn't stomach the shame. That's the raw material of a good officer. I'd not see it broken tonight, because it hasn't finished being made. I have been a policeman for a long time now. I have commanded a division of my own, and I have never in all those years been as ashamed, or as changed, as I was in the moment the man I had cuffed and mocked and left to bleed stood in his own blood and asked the Crown Prince of Eldermore to go easy on me because he thought I might someday be worth something. Rowan looked at Vale for a long moment. Then he looked at me, and the visor lifted a little. He speaks for you, the Crown Prince said. Do you understand what that is worth? There is not a general in my father's army who could buy what he has just given you for free. What is your name again, Constable? Kelser de Verick Kell. Constable Kell. You will not be broken tonight. Sergeant Vale has asked it, and I will not refuse him anything, least of all tonight. But understand me, you are spared not because what you did was small, but because you refused the lie that would have hidden it. Had you taken your superintendent's offer, had you let this night be written up as a courtesy, I would have ended you where you stand and thought no more of it. You are standing because you told the truth against your own interest. Remember exactly what that cost you and exactly what it bought you. That is the whole of the law, Constable, in one night. See that you never forget the lesson, because you very nearly learned it the other way. I won't forget it, sir, I said, and I never have. Then the Crown Prince turned, and the mercy went out of him like a light switched off, and he looked at Superintendent Vare. Vare had been standing very still through all of this, I think in the hope that stillness might make the room forget him. It had not. Rowan looked at him the way you look at something you have found on the sole of your boot. And you, the Crown Prince said, you are the senior man here. This is your division, your station, your desk sergeant, your constable. When you arrived and learned who this man was, and you learned it, Superintendent, I can see in your face that you learned it early. What was the first thing you did? Vare said nothing. I'll tell him, sir, I said, since he won't. He ordered the whole night erased. No arrest, no cuffing, no record. He said Sergeant Vale had been injured helping us detain suspects, and that we'd rendered him every courtesy, and he threatened to have any man who told it true walking a more beat until he was 60. Those were his words, sir, in front of this whole room. The silence that followed was the worst kind. Color Sergeant Rook made a low sound of disgust. Old Osric from the stretcher said, there it is. There's your rot, not the boy, him. So, said the Crown Prince very softly to Superintendent Vare, a guardsman of the king's household is cuffed and left to bleed by your division, and your instinct, your first, trained, senior instinct, is not to write it, but to hide it, and to threaten honest men into silence to protect your figures. Do you know, I think that is a worse thing than the constable's whole night. He did wrong in an instant in the dark, out of a young man's stupid certainty, and then he could not live with it. You did wrong in a warm lit room in cold blood with all the facts before you, and you would have lived with it very comfortably indeed. Rowan turned away from him as though he could no longer bear the sight. My father's officers will call on you in the morning, Superintendent, not the police, my father's. You will answer to the Crown for what you tried to bury tonight, and I promise you that you will find the King's memory for this kind of thing very long. You are relieved. Wait outside. You are not fit to be in the same room as the men on that bench, and the men on that bench are criminals. And Superintendent Vare, divisional commander, ambitious man, the hard, lean face that had walked in an hour before certain of a quick collar and a good night's figures, went out of the door of his own station, past a crowd of market people who had heard every word, and I never saw him in a uniform again. The rest of the justice was quieter and cleaner, and I tell it briefly because it is the part the ballads get right. The girl's telephone was watched by Color Sergeant Rook, by Dr. Pell, by Harlow, by the Crown Prince himself. All of us crowded round that little glowing screen in the gaslight, and it showed the whole of it exactly as Vale and Osric had said, and exactly opposite to how the two brothers on the bench had sworn. 3 men on an old man at a candle stall. A knife. The old man going down. A big man in a dark coat coming out of the lane at a run, going through them like the wrath of the king. The knife man cutting across Vale's ribs as Vale wrenched the blade from his hand, and then breaking and running east toward the river. And Vale, you could see it even on that small screen, and the room went very quiet watching it, Vale not chasing the runner, not seeing to his own bleeding side, but going straight to the old man against the crates, kneeling in the muck, pulling the neckcloth from his own throat and pressing it into the wound, and staying there, until the lamplight of 2 approaching constables swung round the corner of the cut. Denny Cobb and his brother stopped lying when they saw the video. There is no lie left to tell when a room has watched the truth on a screen. They were charged that night robbery, wounding, and the false witness they had sworn against the man who stopped them, which in Eldermore is its own grave crime. And Denny Cobb, in the shabby way of small men caught in a large wrong, tried at once to save himself by giving up the third, the one who had done the actual cutting and run for the river. He gave the name and the bolt hole freely, and the guardsmen and a pair of sober constables went and took the man before dawn, still wet from the river, the knife thrown but the wound on Osric matching its blade all the same. He was the worst of the 3 and he got the most of the law, and I will not spend more words on him. He is a footnote. The story was never about him. The story was about the old man on the stretcher and the giant in the chair and what the Crown did next. Because Crown Prince Rowan did not leave when the justice was settled. He went to the stretcher first, before anything, before he saw to his own friend, and he knelt down by old Osric Brand the candle seller the way, I understood later, he had once been taught to kneel by a man who knelt to a wounded stranger in an alley, and he took the old soldier's hand. They tell me you were a soldier once, the Crown Prince said. Private, sir, Osric managed. Long ago, the old regiment, nobody now, just candles. You are not nobody, said Rowan. You are a man who would not be robbed on his own doorstep at 71 because 40 years is 40 years. And you are the man whose cry sent Marius Vale off his safe road and into a knife fight to save you. And you are the man who lay bleeding in an alley and still had the wit and the courage to name the ribbon on his chest to a station full of fools who wouldn't listen. If not for you, they might have buried the truth of tonight with the smooth lie. You held the line, soldier, one last time from a stretcher. The Crown does not forget that either. Osric Brand, 71 years old, wept then without shame, the way old men weep, and held the Crown Prince's hand, and said only, over and over, he called me soldier. In the alley. He called me soldier. He knew what he was looking at, said Rowan. He always does. They took Osric Brand up the hill in the Crown Prince's own carriage to the palace physicians, which no candle seller in the history of Eldermore had ever ridden in, and he mended well and slowly, and I will come back to him, because his story does not end on that stretcher. But first I have to tell you about the last thing that happened in the station, the thing that finished the making of me, because it did not involve the Crown Prince at all. It involved the man I had cuffed. The doctor wanted Vale carried up to the palace too, and Vale would not be carried. He would walk to the carriage on his own feet, or he would walk home on them, he said, and there was no arguing with him. And in the end color, Sergeant Rook just shook his head and muttered something about the mule he'd always been. So Vale got himself up out of the chair slowly, with the doctor at one elbow and Rook at the other, and he made his way across the station floor toward the door, past the desk, past the bench, past me, where I stood in the middle of the room not knowing what a man is supposed to do with himself after a night like that one. And he stopped in front of me, the huge man, the gray face, the bound side, the ribbon I had not known how to read. He stopped and he looked down at me, and I made myself look up and take whatever was coming, because I had earned it and I would not flinch from it the way he had not flinched from the steel. But what came was not what I had earned. "You did a hard thing tonight," Sergeant Vale said. "Not the alley. The alley was just a young man being certain, and every young man is. You'll cure yourself of that or the job will cure you, and it looks like tonight started the cure. No, the hard thing was after, when the smooth lie was there for the taking and it had your name on the good side of it, and you looked at it and you put it down and you told the truth against yourself out loud more than once, when nobody could have made you." He nodded slowly. "That's the whole of this work, constable. Anyone can be certain. The rare thing is the man who'd rather be right than be safe. I saw you find that in yourself tonight in the worst hour of your service, and I want you to know a man saw it. It'll matter to you one day that somebody saw." I could barely get the words out. "Sergeant, I cuffed you. I left you bleeding. I laughed at you. You don't owe me a kind word. You owe me nothing but the back of your hand." "I owe every man the truth about himself," Vale said. "The bad and the good both. I gave you the bad in the alley by letting you feel it, and I'm giving you the good now because it's just as true and you need it more. Don't waste either." And then he did a thing I have never told anyone, that I am only telling now because I am old and it is time these things were written down true. He put out his big right hand, the hand I had put in irons 3 hours before, and he offered it to me to shake. To me. And I took it and I could not speak, and he closed his hand around mine, firm and warm and steady, a soldier's hand, and he said low, so only I could hear it, "A man's name should be enough, constable. Yours is a good one now. Keep it that way." And he let go, and he walked out of the station on his own 2 feet to the carriage that had come down the hill for him, and I stood there in the gaslight with my hand still feeling the grip of his, and I wept, which I had not done since I was a boy, and Pharaoh, my old slow patient partner, came and stood beside me and did not say a word, which was the kindest thing he could have done. You will want to know how it all came out, so I will tell you plainly, the way a man closes a ledger. The king learned everything by morning, and the king's memory, as his son had promised, proved very long. Superintendent Vare was not merely dismissed. He was called before a crown inquiry into what he had tried to bury, and the finding was that a senior officer who, knowing the truth, orders it hidden and threatens honest men into silence, has done a thing worse than any single wrong in the street, because the street can be policed, but a rod at the top poisons the water everyone drinks. He never held office again. I have not one word of pity for him, and I have made my peace with that. The 2 brothers and the river runner went to the assizes and were justly dealt with, and the false witness they had sworn against Vale was named in the sentence as its own crime, so that it would be written in the record forever that these were men who had not only robbed and wounded an old soldier, but had tried to hang their guilt on the neck of the man who stopped them. In Eldermore, we hold that a lie told to ruin an innocent man is a kind of second wound, and the law treated it so. Old Osric Brand mended. The crown paid his physicians, and when he was on his feet, the king's household did a thing that the old man told and retold at his stall for the rest of his life to anyone who would stand still for it. They found in the regimental rolls of 49 years before the record of Private Osric Brand's service, and they had it read out, and the king sent him, by the hand of Sergeant Vale himself, who insisted on carrying it down the hill in person. The campaign medal that a clerk's error, half a century gone, had failed to award him. So the old candle seller who had thought himself nobody, just candles, ended his days a decorated soldier of Eldermore after all, and the man who pinned it to his coat at the third stall from the fountain, with the whole market watching and cheering, was the giant I had cuffed in the dark. I was there for it. I made sure to be there for it. Osric caught my eye across the crowd and grinned his gap-toothed grin and shouted. He called me soldier, constable, in the alley, and look, he was right. And I laughed and my eyes stung, and I thought, not for the last time, that I had been given a second life the night I so nearly threw the first one away. The girl with the telephone, her name was Wenna, and she worked at a draper's 2 lanes over, was thanked by the palace and given a purse that set her up in a little shop of her own within the year, because the crown of Eldermore does not forget the ordinary person who holds up the truth when the powerful would prefer it stayed down. Pharaoh, my partner, was quietly commended, for it was noted in the record that when a certain young constable was reading a scene wrong at speed, the older man was the one who went quiet and careful and sent word up the chain that did not match the easy story. I told him he'd saved me. He said in his slow way, "No, you saved you when you wouldn't take Vare's lie. I just kept the seat warm till you got there. I have thought about that sentence for 30 years. As for me, I was not broken as the Crown Prince had said. I was not even formally disciplined in the end, though I asked to be, because Sergeant Vale had spoken for me and a prince had heard it, and that in Eldermore is a shield no regulation can pierce. But I did not let myself off. I went back to the beat a different man, a slower man, an ask-first man, a let-them-finish man, and I carried the memory of that night into every scene I ever attended after it. When I made sergeant, and later when I made superintendent of my own division, the same rank Vare had disgraced, which I took as a private penance and a private pride both. I told this story to every young constable who came up under me on their first hard night when they were certain, the way I had been certain. I told them about the giant in the dark coat, and the cuffs, and the laugh, and the ribbon I couldn't read, and the smooth lie I nearly took, and the hand he offered me anyway. And I ended it always the same way, with the thing he said to me, because it is the truest thing I have ever been told about this work or any other. A man's name should be enough. And it is only enough if you keep it clean, not by never being wrong, for every man is wrong, and the certain young ones most of all, but by what you do in the hour after, when the lie is there for the taking and your name is on the safe side of it, and you have to choose. That is the whole of it. That is the entire law, learned in one gaslit station on one cold night, from the one man in the street who had done everything right. Sergeant Marius Vale healed, as he'd said he would, and drilled on it inside the month, over the doctor's protests. And then he did the thing that I think of everything tells you most truly who he was. He went back to his post. He could have had anything, still, the Crown Prince all but begged him after that night to take the colonelcy and the estate, and the soft honored place at court that he had earned 3 times over. The king offered again too. And Marius Vale thanked them, and refused them again, and asked again for the only thing he had ever wanted, and got it. To go back and stand a guardsman's post at the palace gate in the ranks, under the tall black bearskin, anonymous, one still figure among many, guarding with his own 2 hands the thing he loved. I went to see him at it once, a year or so after. I stood across the forecourt in the crowd of tourists with their phones and their pointing, and I watched him stand his post in the sun, motionless, immaculate red tunic and white gloves and the rifle at his shoulder, his eyes forward, unreadable, exactly the kind of tall, silent figure that a certain sort of fool looks at and thinks, nobody, just a statue in a costume. And I watched a boy break from a tour group and pull a face at him and shout something to make him laugh, and I watched the great man not so much as blink, iron and patient and utterly at peace, keeping the secret of himself the way he'd kept it for 11 years, and would keep it for the rest of his life. The Cross of Valor in a drawer somewhere, and the debt of a kingdom on his shoulders, and nothing on his face at all but duty. And I understood at last, standing there, the thing I had been too certain to understand in the alley. The stillness is not emptiness. The silence is not nobody. Behind the motionless faces at those gates, there may stand a man who once threw his body across a child and took the blade and asked for nothing, and went back to standing in the rain, and you would never know it, and he would never tell you, and that not telling is the very heart of what he is. I took off my hat to him, across the whole width of the forecourt in the middle of the crowd. He could not have seen it. He was looking forward as he was sworn to. But I did it anyway, for the record of my own soul, to the man I had cuffed and mocked and left to bleed, who had shaken my hand in a police station and told me my name was a good one now and to keep it that way. I have tried, Sergeant. For 30 years I have tried. And every young officer I ever trained knows your story, though not one of them ever knew your name because you'd not have wanted them to, and because, in the end, you were right about that too. A man's name should be enough. But sometimes, on a cold night in a dark alley, it isn't, and then the whole weight of a kingdom has to come down the hill to say what the man was too honorable to say himself, and teach a certain foolish boy in a police coat the one lesson he never forgot. That is who he really was. That is who I cuffed. And that is the whole of the truth, set down at last, by the last man on earth who had any right to tell it, and the most grateful.